The night my husband sat down at the dining room table with that expression I had learned to recognize as the expression of someone who has already made a decision and is only searching for the least confrontational way to announce it, and told me his mother needed to move into the house my parents had bought and paid for in full, I did not argue, I did not cry, I did not raise my voice, I simply nodded calmly, walked to the kitchen to pour more water, and on the way back to the table I had already decided exactly what I was going to do. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people who discover too late that actions have consequences, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Teresa. I am 34 years old. I work as a financial analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm, and during 6 years of marriage to Roland I learned many things about him. I learned that he was generous to the point of recklessness when it came to his family of origin. I learned that he had an extraordinary capacity for reinterpreting reality in ways that consistently favored his mother, and I learned that Nora, his mother, was the kind of person who mistakes kindness for weakness and interprets every concession as an invitation to ask for more. And for 6 years I had been patient and accommodating enough to have created, without intending to, the impression that I had no limits, or that the limits I had could be moved if someone pushed them with enough conviction. The house was a subject that had been hovering in the atmosphere of our marriage since before we were married, because my parents, Gerald and Carol, had purchased the property as a wedding gift, had paid for it completely in cash, had signed the deed in my name only, had obtained a notarized gift letter, and had explained to me, with the clarity that people develop when they have seen enough family conflicts in their lifetime to understand how to prevent the next one, that the property was in my name for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with Roland as a person, but with the principle that things that come from one family belong to that family and must be protected with documents rather than good intentions. And I had nodded and filed those documents in a folder in my desk drawer without thinking too much about them, because at the time I was a woman in love who could not imagine a scenario where the paperwork would matter more than the trust. Nora had visited our house exactly 17 times in 6 years. I counted because I am a financial analyst and quantifying things is how I process the world, and during each of those 17 visits she had made some observation about the house that on the surface sounded like genuine interest but had underneath it the texture of something closer to assessment. The first time she asked how many square feet the garden was. The third time she asked whether the guest room had a private bathroom, and stood in the doorway looking inside longer than necessary for someone who was simply admiring a room. The seventh time she commented that the neighborhood was a very quiet in a tone I interpreted then as a compliment and now, with more information available, interpret differently. And the last time, 3 months before the dining room night, she had walked through the living room with her hands clasped behind her back like someone taking a tour of a place she already considers her own. Roland and Nora had the kind of relationship that psychologists describe with specific vocabulary I had begun searching for online approximately in the 3rd year of our marriage, a relationship where the adult child never fully separates emotionally, where the mother uses illness, past sacrifice, or economic vulnerability as currency, and where every decision the son makes passes through an invisible filter that has his mother's name written on it. And Roland was not a bad man, I say that because it is true and because it matters for understanding the story. He was a man who loved his mother with an intensity that made it impossible for him to see her clearly, and that inability was at the center of every problem we had. Nora's financial situation had been a recurring subject from the beginning. She had a small pension, had been renting the same apartment for 9 years, and periodically Roland would mention that something would have to be done here about his mother's situation. And I had contributed without complaining for years. We had covered her rent several times when she had difficulties, we had paid medical expenses, we had sent money for apartment repairs, and I had never raised a formal objection because I understood that family is family and that supporting aging parents is something decent people do. But there is a difference between supporting someone and handing them your house, and that difference was exactly what Roland seemed incapable of seeing. What triggered the dining room night was a phone call Nora made to Roland 3 weeks earlier, a call he did not tell me about at the time, but that I reconstructed afterward through fragments of conversation, and a text message I saw without meaning to on his phone while I was charging in the kitchen. And in that call Nora had told him that her landlord had notified her that he would not be renewing her lease. that she could not afford another apartment in the same neighborhood, that her health was not good, though she never specified exactly what was wrong, and that she didn't know what she was going to do, which was the specific phrase Nora used when she wanted Roland to make a decision she had already made for him. 3 weeks after that call was the dining room night, and I already knew, because I know my husband and I know his mother, that something was about to be announced, and what I did not yet know, what I would discover 6 days later while reviewing the statement from our joint account with the same attention I give to my clients' financial reports, was that the conversation between Roland and Nora had produced consequences that went far beyond a moving invitation, consequences with specific numbers, specific dates, and a pattern that someone with my professional background could only describe with one word: fraud. The bank statement I reviewed 6 days after the dining room night was not the regular monthly statement I checked on the first of every month with the punctuality my father had taught me. It was the detailed statement with the full transaction history for the previous 18 months that I downloaded at 11 at night while Roland was asleep, because something in the way he had reacted when I casually asked about that month's expenses, a slight pause before answering, a response slightly too specific to be spontaneous, had activated in me the same instinct that activates when I am reviewing a client's books and something does not add up. What I found was a pattern of transfers to an account I did not recognize, transfers that began 14 months ago, that occurred at irregular intervals to avoid triggering automatic fixed amount alerts, that varied between $800 and $2,300 per transaction, and that totaled $23,400 across 14 months, and the receiving account was registered to a company called Integrated Services NV, which was a name generic enough to go unnoticed on a bank statement and specific enough that I, who work with corporate structures every day, knew immediately that ENV was probably not a coincidence but a set of initials, and the name that came to mind immediately was Nora Vian Waver. I did not wake Roland that night. I saved the statements, closed the laptop, and sat in the darkness of the living room for approximately 1 hour processing the information with the part of my brain that is not a wife but an analyst, and what that part of my brain told me was that I needed 3 things before making any move. First, confirmation that the company was what I believed it to be. Second, a forensic accountant who could document the pattern in a way that was legally usable. And third, a family attorney who could explain to me exactly what my legal position was with respect to the house, the marriage, and that money, and who could tell me all of that before I said a single additional word inside my own home. The following 12 days were the 12 most complex days of my adult life, because I had to continue living with apparent normalcy while doing things that required considerable concentration. The following Monday, I called a forensic accountant named Andrea Cole, whom a colleague had recommended months earlier for completely different reasons, and explained the situation in general terms and sent her the statements through a secure email. And she told me that what I described had all the elements of a classic diversion structure and that she needed 3 days to document it formally. The following Tuesday, I went to the office of a family attorney named Laura Campos, who had been recommended to me by a colleague as the person you call when the situation is serious. And during that 90-minute meeting, Laura reviewed the house deed, the notarized gift letter from my parents, and the preliminary statements. And when she finished reading, she looked up and said, "Teresa, the house is completely yours and there is no legal argument that changes that. And the money situation is a separate conversation that could have very serious consequences for your husband." Meanwhile at home, Roland had begun mentioning Nora's move in ways that were clearly designed to normalize it gradually. On Tuesday, he said that we would need to make space in the guest room closet. On Thursday, he asked whether I had a preference for which side of the room Nora would use for her things. On Saturday, he mentioned that Nora cooked very well here and could probably help around the house. And I responded to each of these observations with neutral monosyllables because Laura had told me explicitly not to confront anything yet, to wait, to let the other side feel that they had control of the situation, and to save my moves for the right moment. The right moment arrived in a way I had not planned but which, in retrospect, was perfect, because Roland organized a family dinner on the 3rd Sunday of the month, a dinner to which he invited his mother, his younger brother Marco and Marco's wife, and during that dinner, after the second course, Roland wiped his mouth with his napkin, looked around the table with the expression of someone who is about to make an announcement that fills him with pride, and said that he had something important to share with the family, and that important something was that Nora would be moving permanently into our home the following month, that they had discussed the matter and were very happy with the decision, and that he hoped everyone would celebrate with them. There was a very brief silence after that announcement, the kind of silence that exists when people in a room are calibrating how to react before reacting, and it was during that silence that I stood up from my chair, walked to the study 10 meters from the dining room, took out the folder I had prepared for days earlier with Andrea and Laura, came back to the table, placed it in the center beside the pasta dish that was still half full, sat down, smiled, and said, "I'm so glad you brought that up, because I also have something to share with the family." What was in that folder was 4 sets of documents separated by color-coded dividers, and I explained them one by one in the same voice I use when presenting a financial analysis to a client, without raising it, without accelerating it, without emotionally loading any phrase, because Laura had told me that the key to a moment like that was not emotion but clarity, and clarity was the only thing I wanted in that room. The first divider contained the original house deed with my name as sole owner, the notarized gift letter from my parents with the date and notary signature, and a 1-page summary prepared by Laura explaining that under state law property gifted before marriage and titled exclusively in one spouse's name does not constitute shared marital property and cannot be permanently occupied by third parties without the express written consent of the title holder, and that such consent, in this case, did not exist and would not exist. And while I was explaining this, Nora, who had been sitting with a barely concealed expression of satisfaction since Roland's announcement, began to change expression in a way that was difficult not to observe. The second divider contained Andrea Cole's forensic report, which documented across 17 pages the pattern of transfers from our joint account to the Integrated Services NV account over 14 months, the total of $23,400, the shell company structure that Andrea had traced to its official registration where Nora Vian Waver appeared as the sole director, and a footnote where Andrea noted that the pattern of variation in transfer amounts was consistent with a deliberate strategy to avoid automatic fixed amount detection alerts, suggesting prior knowledge of banking detection systems. And when I finished explaining that divider, Roland, who had been completely still since I took out the folder, said my name very quietly, just my name with no sentence after it, and I continued. The third divider contained a letter from Laura addressed to Roland in his capacity as co-holder of the joint account, explaining that depending on his level of knowledge and participation in the transfers, his legal exposure could range from civil liability for the full diverted amount to criminal consequences if it were determined he had actively participated in the scheme, and that Laura was available to meet with him and his own attorney in the following days to explore available options. And it was upon reading this letter that Marco, Roland's brother, stood up from the table and said that he and his wife would wait outside, and they left without saying anything further, and I did not stop them because I understood it was the right decision for them. The fourth divider contained something no one at that table was expecting, which was a settlement proposal prepared by Laura with 3 numbered options. The first was full restitution of the $23,400 within 30 days in exchange for my not filing a formal complaint with financial authorities. The second was initiating a marital asset separation process with a full audit of the marriage's finances from the beginning. And the third was Roland signing a formal notarized waiver of any future claim to the property regardless of the outcome of the marriage, and that he choose one of the 3 options before Thursday of that week. Nora spoke for the first time since I had taken out the folder, and what she said was that all of this was an overreaction, that she had only accepted what Roland had offered her, that I was destroying a family over money, and that she hoped I would reconsider, and I looked at her for a moment before responding. Looked at her the way you look at someone when you finally have all the information necessary to see that person with complete clarity, and told her that the documents were not an overreaction but a precise description of what had occurred, that if Roland had offered her something that was not his to offer, then the problem was between the 2 of them and not between her and me, and that the only person in that room who had been overreacting to anything had been her, for years, about what belonged to her and what did not. What happened in the weeks that followed was a process Laura managed with efficiency and without drama. Roland chose the first option, full restitution, and transferred the money in 3 payments over the following month. Nora did not move into the house. She returned to her apartment which, as it turned out, she could in fact afford because the landlord's notice had been an amplified version of a situation that was actually a rent increase request that was entirely negotiable. And Roland and I entered a couples therapy process that he proposed and that I accepted on the condition that it be with a professional neither of us had previously known and who had no relationship with his family. The marriage survived. I say that because it is true and because not all of these stories end in divorce, though this one came very close. And what changed was not the love but the structure. Roland established for the first time in his adult life a clear boundary with his mother that did not depend on my pressure to exist but on his own understanding of what had happened. And that boundary included a direct conversation with Nora where he explained that the money had been returned, that their move would not happen, and that any future assistance would come with transparent conditions agreed upon by both of us, and Nora accepted because she had no alternative. But more important than her acceptance was Roland's clarity, because that clarity was something I had spent 6 years waiting for without knowing precisely that it was what I was waiting for. There are things I learned from all of this that completely reorganized my understanding of limits within a family, and the first is that legal documents are not acts of distrust but acts of clarity, and that the difference between a house that is yours and a house you believe is yours is exactly one paper signed by a notary. And the second is that confronting a problem with evidence rather than emotion is not coldness but respect. Respect for yourself and respect even for the person who caused you the problem, because evidence does not permit convenient reinterpretations and that does everyone a favor. And the third is that genuine compassion and firm limits are not opposites. You can understand someone's history, you can have empathy for their difficulties, and still say with complete clarity that certain things are not available, that they never were, and that they will not be, and that this refusal is not cruelty but simply the truth spoken aloud with documents on the table.